Resuming debate, the honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's an honour today to rise to speak to motion M-133, and I thank the member from Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry, for bringing it forward. And I'm happy to say that I certainly will be supporting it. And this motion asks the government to recognize the contribution of over 100,000 British home children to Canada, the hardships and stigmas that many endured, the importance of reflecting on their story by declaring September 28th of every year British Home Child Day in Canada. And I'd like to begin by thanking my friend Art Joyce, whose grandfather was a British home child and who's written a book on these Canadians and their experiences. Much of the information and many of the words I used to prepare the speech came directly from Mr. Joyce. My predecessor in this place, Alex Adamanenko, tabled a motion in the previous Parliament asking for an apology from the Canadian government to the British home children and their descendants, and I was happy to table the same motion in this Parliament. And on February 16th, 2017, the House of Commons here unanimously passed a very similar motion from the member from Montcalm, asking that the House recognize the injustice, abuse, and suffering endured by the British home children, as well as the efforts, participation, and contribution of these children and their descendants within our communities, and offer its sincere apology to the British home children and their descendants. So who were the British home children? They were children from poor families in the United Kingdom who were taken from their families, orphanages, and state workhouses and sent to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and Canada received the vast majority of these children. Those countries assisted with the transportation and immigration costs because these children were seen as a virtually free source of labour on newly developing farms and homesteads. British parish priests were given the authority to take children into care as wards of the state if it was determined that the family was too poor to support them, a practice called philanthropic abductions. Poor parents unwilling to give up their children had little choice. Once taken from their families, children were essentially branded orphans, regardless of whether the parents survived or not. Although parents could occasionally visit their children in the orphanages, some were shocked to discover that what they had considered a temporary placement had become permanent, or worse, that they had been shipped overseas. Most of these parents would never see their children again. This practice began in 1869 and continued in Canada until the last shipment of boys and girls arrived on Vancouver Island at the Prince of Wales Fairbridge Farm School near Duncan in 1948. During its heyday, single shipments of children sent by steamboat across the Atlantic could reach as many as 200 boys and girls, some as young as 5, during the earlier phase of the program. There were more than 100,000 boys and girls sent to Canada during this time, and Statistics Canada has estimated that about 4 million Canadians are descendants of these children, about 1 in 8 Canadians. So if this is a truly representative chamber, that means more than 40 of us here in the House of Commons are descended from one of the home children. The organizations that sent the children to Canada said they would have better lives, but in fact, they were required to sign indenture contracts as labourers and were only allowed to leave service upon reaching legal age. And although the contract stipulated a modest income, most were never paid. The contracts typically required that children be given food, shelter, adequate clothing, as well as regular access to school and church. Often, many of these basic provisions were not met, with children being made to sleep in barns or unheated attics, or to endure Canadian winters without proper winter clothing. Contracts were seldom enforced, as neither the charities nor the governments involved had enough staff assigned to do this. Most home children never finished school, as they were required for work. Beatings for the boys and sexual abuse for the girls were not uncommon, and very few were adopted by their host families. "We were here to work," one adult home child recalled. British home children made up a substantial portion of volunteers in both World Wars, up to 10,000 serving in World War I alone. Art Joyce's grandfather, Cyril William Joyce, was sent to Canada in 1926 as a boy of 16. His father, George, was a traveling salesman, and the family lived in the East End of London, the epicenter of poverty in that city. Cyril spent several years working as an indentured farm laborer in northern Alberta until reaching legal age. He never spoke of it much with his wife and children, and spoke even less of his family in England. His mother had signed the emigration papers, and he had never spoke of her again. Cyril was unable to loosen the bonds on these painful memories and took his family's secrets to the grave. That shame, that unwillingness to speak of his past, is a common theme with British home children. Descendants of home children are left with a huge hole in their lives, not knowing their family history, not knowing their parents' and grandparents' true experiences. Despite the fact that our government's paid to bring 100,000 of these boys and girls here, then abandon them to their fates on isolated farms, most Canadians know nothing about this dark chapter in our history. Art Joyce points out that, and I quote, "Not once in all my years of public schooling did I learn about Canada's home children." And I can say the same thing, Mr. Speaker. He felt compelled to research his grandfather's history and the stories of other British home children in a book called Laying the Children's Ghost to Rest. So what have other countries done to recognize the British home children? Australia's former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd invited British home children and their descendants to Parliament House in Canberra for a public apology on November 16, 2009. Many of those in the crowd were in tears. On February 24, 2010, Prime Minister Gordon Brown publicly apologized to the families of the approximately 130,000 children who were sent away from Britain. For the elderly survivors and their descendants, numbering now into the millions in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, it was a long-awaited moment, one some thought might never arrive. As Art's uncle Rob Joyce wrote upon hearing of Brown's apology, "It is a great day. I wish we could be reading this with Dad now. That would have made it even better. I understand Dad better now than I ever did, and why he was sad at times for reasons I never knew. An understanding that, like the British government's apology, has come sadly much too late." And on the subject of apologies, I would only add that while this House did issue an unanimous apology a few months ago, that apology was made unannounced. To my knowledge, no one from the British home children community was present in the House to hear that the member from Montcalm put forward his motion. It would be very meaningful to these families if the government would issue a formal apology given by the Prime Minister, with family members invited to be present, as we have done so for so many other government apologies. And I think that the British home children who were taken from their families, lost their childhoods to hard labor, and lived with the shame for the rest of their lives deserve no less. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll close by saying that having a British Home Child Day in Canada would be one more positive step on the road to healing those families. And the day chosen, September 28th, is coincidentally Art Joyce's birthday. Thank you.
Resume.